Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here and see so many friends here today. It's a real pleasure for me. I love coming to Japan. And as I hope you know, the Columbia University has a deep and abiding commitment to the study and engagement of Japan and Asia. And nothing exemplifies that more than the Center on Japanese Economy and Business created by Hugh Patrick. And is really a thriving center of research and analysis and engagement on so many different dimensions of Japan, the Japanese economy, and Japan in the world. So it's a tremendous privilege for me to participate in this gathering this year and other years. And a particular pleasure for me to introduce Wendy Cutler. I think no one could give you a deeper and more informed perspective on U.S. trade policy than Wendy Cutler. We actually met when I worked at USTR for a mere 3.5 years in the 89 to 93 period, and Wendy had joined 1 year earlier. She had an extraordinary career at USTR, serving in many senior posts for 28 years. She worked initially in the office of the GATT. She worked on semiconductors. She was a chief negotiator on the Korea agreement between the United States. She worked on China matters as well as many multilateral issues. So whether it's bilateral, regional, and of course was a principal negotiator of the TPP agreement. So whether bilateral, multilateral, or regional initiatives, or sectoral, I think Wendy Cutler can give you a historical perspective and a current perspective on the fundamental features of U.S. trade policy and negotiating objectives. Since leaving USTR, she joined Asia Society and is the managing director of the Asia Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and a vice president of the Asia Society Institute. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Wendy Cutler to give her keynote address. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much. I'd just like to say that when Merritt and I started at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, we were both children. It's really my honor to be here today and to open this conference. It looks like a great program, and I'd like to thank the Center on Japanese Economy and Business for inviting me. So I'm here to talk about trade. It's quite a topical issue, both in Washington and Tokyo, and all around the region and the world these days. The Trump administration has sure shaken things up and has reversed course on a number of areas and issues with respect to U.S. trade policy. And while overall U.S.-Japan relations could not be in better shape, trade remains a wild card, the unpredictable element in our overall bilateral relationship. The most recent announcement of the initiation, or soon to be initiated, national security investigation under Section 232 on imports of auto and auto parts has caught many by surprise all around the world, including in the United States. Although it appears to be motivated by the President's frustration with Mexico in the NAFTA negotiations, it will have far broader implications if action is indeed taken, including for Japan, and will also have grave consequences, I believe, for the WTO, which I'm sure the next panel will touch upon. Moreover, during the same week that the U.S. was talking about putting up barriers to auto and auto imports, Japan was taking an important step by passing the TPP in the Diet's lower house, a major milestone and an important step towards putting the TPP into effect. And Japan deserves enormous credit for picking up the pieces on TPP after the U.S. exit and leading the remaining countries into concluding the TPP without us. The contrast between these two developments, both one being protectionist measures, the other being trade liberalizing initiatives, could not be sharper. And this afternoon, I'd like to share my thoughts on how I assess the changes in U.S. trade policy under President Trump, both in terms of words and actions. Two, to explain how the U.S.-Japan relationship in trade fits into this equation, and then offer my suggestions on a path forward on trade between our two countries. First, some personal observations on where our bilateral trade relationship stood when Trump took office. In short, it could not have been in a better place. Over a span of 30 years or so, we steadily moved from a relationship characterized by tension and disputes into one of cooperation and partnership. And during my 28 years at USTR, I worked on a lot of negotiations. Some say I had bad luck. I'd like to say I had the pleasure to work on semiconductors, autos, agriculture, insurance, and the list goes on. And these were tough talks filled with acrimony. And upon reflection, this was inevitable because the two sides had divergent objectives. The U.S. felt threatened by Japan's growing dominance in key sectors, while frustrated with Japan's closed market to U.S. exports and investment. The U.S. objective in these negotiations then was to right these wrongs. And Japan was a reluctant negotiating partner with a razor-edge focus on making as few meaningful commitments as possible. And while some progress was made in these negotiations, it seemed like we never really settled an issue for a lasting period of time, reflected in multiple agreements in the same sector. But this dynamic changed dramatically with TPP. We finally shared the same objective in a trade negotiation, and that was we both sought a similar vision of setting high standard rules for the region based on shared values and a desire to achieve these through a multilateral deal. And we chose regional and a multilateral deal in order to have as much impact and value as possible. Of course, this didn't mean that the TPP negotiations were easy, particularly our bilateral negotiations on autos and agriculture and non-tariff measures, which I led. Indeed, there were many breakdowns, there were many breakups, and moments when success seemed elusive. But nevertheless, somehow we both knew that we would be able to bridge our differences. The stakes were high, our determination was great, and ultimately our efforts met with success. And an important reason for this success was that we shared common negotiating objectives. And unlike previous negotiations, we were not working at cross purposes. However, we were not able to enjoy this successful feeling for very long. Upon return from the last TPP round in Atlanta, the U.S. met quickly with sharp resistance, both from certain stakeholders and from our Congress, and soon thereafter, trade became a very hot and highly debated issue in the presidential campaign, and not in a good way. And TPP became what we call the poster child of everything that was wrong with trade. As a result, when our president came into office, he not only had a passion, but a mandate to change things on the trade agenda. And he did so quickly. He withdrew from TPP on the third day of his office, and he made clear on that same day that his administration would pursue bilateral agreements. He approached trade with the following views. First, the past trade agreements and the multilateral trading system have worked against the United States' interests. They've resulted in unfair, unbalanced agreements with benefits flowing to our trading partners, not to the United States. Second, he views our trade agreements and the WTO as having facilitated the export of manufacturing jobs overseas. And in his view, it's critical through trade agreements and through trade actions to bring these manufacturing jobs back home. 3, he underscored the need for reciprocity, a term that many of us had not heard in the years since the U.S.-Japan trade wars. And 4th, the metric for unfairness, in his view, are bilateral trade deficits, and trade deficits with respect to goods trade. They are unacceptable, and in his view, we need to bring them down partner by partner. And how to achieve this? A number of ways. First, through renegotiation of existing trade agreements, and that explains the renegotiation of the Chorus Agreement and the negotiations now underway to renegotiate NAFTA. 2, through extensive use of U.S. trade laws, including laws that haven't been used for many, many years. 3rd, through pressing our trading partners to bring down their bilateral trade deficits by buying more from the United States. And 4th, through calling into question the relevance and value of the WTO while undermining the continued viability of its dispute settlement process. But not surprising, the Trump team has found pursuing this trade agenda as difficult. It's complicated, and there are many factors that have stood in the way of achieving these goals. They include, but are not limited to, number 1, the role of the U.S. Congress, which, as many of you know, Congress has the constitutional authority to regulate trade. Second, there are trade-offs between sectors in our economy when trade actions are taken or trade negotiations are pursued. And the recent 232 case on steel and aluminum have showed these trade-offs. Third, there is an impact on markets and on the U.S. economy and on the global economy based on trade actions. And 4, complicating the trade agenda is the response of our trading partners. They're not always willing to do what we want them to do. Given these constraints and complications, we have seen a pattern of threats and bluster about withdrawing from trade agreements and imposing tariffs, but outcomes seem to be more conventional or not as hardline as the bluster and threats suggest. Also, the outcomes have been weakened by infighting among administration officials with differing views on trade. We once attributed these types of differences among delegations to the Japanese, but right now, it's no secret that people in the Trump administration at senior levels have different views on trade. And in a new twist to U.S. trade policy, it's very transactional these days. Everything seems to be up for negotiation, including, for example, willingness to exchange 232 national security action for progress in negotiations, and even enforcement measures, as evidenced by the recent rollback announced last Friday of the administration's sanctions against the Chinese telecommunications company, ZTE. And furthermore, there appears to be little distinction between long-term friends and allies and those with whom the U.S. has a more adversarial or competitive relationship. There is no reluctance to be tough, or some say even tougher, with our long-term allies. Our trading partners, and I'm sure many in Japan, are trying to understand the evolution and the execution of the president's trade policy, and specifically how to interpret the NAFTA negotiations, which continue even though a deadline was recently passed. Second, the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, and an impending investigation under 232 on auto and auto parts. And 3, the recent deal with China, which focused more on purchases of U.S. goods rather than seeking long-term fundamental changes. And our trading partners are trying to figure out what this potentially means for them as they shape their trade posture towards the United States from both an offensive and a defensive perspective. Allow me now to offer my thoughts on what this means for the U.S.-Japan trade relationship. It concerns me that having jointly led the TPP to a successful conclusion in 2015 with ambitious prospects for further close cooperation on a range of trade issues, that we may again find ourselves headed towards trade friction and disagreement. While the trade relationship got off to a good start with the launch of the ASO-Pence dialogue, we find ourselves in a tenser situation 18 months later. So let's discuss where each side is coming from. From the U.S. perspective, there are a number of issues on their mind. First, let's keep in mind that President Trump has longstanding views on U.S.-Japan trade based on his belief that it's unbalanced, unfair, and non-reciprocal. These views were shaped in the 1980s and early 90s during the trade war days. Second, the administration is concerned with the bilateral trade deficit with Japan, which is large and unacceptable in their view and needs to come down. And automotive trade is largely responsible for this deficit. Three, the administration appears to be disappointed with the ASO-Pence dialogue, having not produced results, particularly on trade. And some even suggest that Japan created this mechanism and is using this mechanism as a delaying tactic to avoid making solid commitments. And there's a concern that while Japan is willing to make trade concessions to the other TPP countries and the EU, leaving the United States behind. And while there is an appreciation for the support on China trade issues, this is not enough to compensate for the imbalance in our bilateral trading relationship. Well, Japan sees things a bit differently. This is what I hear from my Japanese colleagues. Number one, we addressed bilateral trade issues with the United States in TPP. The United States, had a solution on autos, on agriculture, on beef safeguards, and other non-tariff measures, but you withdrew and therefore walked away from these solutions. Second, our bilateral trade deficit should be put in perspective. It's less than 20% of the U.S. goods trade deficit with China, and it's only 8.5% of the U.S.'s overall trade deficit, down significantly from 28% just 20 years ago. Three, it's too narrow to judge our economic relationship just based on trade flows. Please keep in mind the enormous contribution of Japanese automotive and other FDI in the United States and hundreds of thousands of jobs it creates. And we share your concerns in China's unfair trade practices, and we need to lift the standards of trade rules to adequately address the challenges that the Chinese system poses. That's where we should focus our joint efforts. But you are making it difficult to do so based on your raising tariffs on steel and aluminum and now threatening to do the same on auto and auto parts. We have no flexibility to go beyond our TPP commitments on agriculture. Our politics just won't allow it. And we're not interested in a bilateral FTA. We believe a plurilateral approach is the way to go. So please rejoin the TPP. So where does this leave us? You can see that both countries have different perspectives on trade, and they each seek a different solution. It's easy to conclude that the differences are intractable, and perhaps they will prove to be. But given the importance of our overall alliance and bilateral relationship, it's in our mutual interest to find a way to bridge these differences and get the U.S.-Japan trade relations on a solid footing. And what might a solution look like? Well, let me offer some thoughts, keeping in mind the perspectives and positions of each side, and also my sense of what has worked and not worked in the past. First, with respect to agriculture, this is key to unlocking a path forward. In TPP, we achieved meaningful market access in agriculture. We saw some tariffs not going to zero and some quotas being limited, but overall, we felt comfortable that we achieved meaningful market access to this important sector. This led to criticism at home and among stakeholders in Congress that we didn't go far enough. But with Japan on the verge of giving TPP market access to the other 10 TPP partners, as well as to the EU through the bilateral FTA, our stakeholders in Congress may view things differently and now be satisfied with the TPP outcome on agriculture. So in my mind, the U.S. should provide assurances to Japan that the United States won't seek more on agriculture from Japan. For such an assurance to be credible, however, the administration needs to work and get a buy-in from our stakeholders and Congress. Second, with respect to automotive issues, this is going to continue to be a focus of the president. And it's not just with Japan. He's focused on this sector with respect to our other trading partners, whether it be Mexico, Germany, or Korea. And in some respects, it's unfortunate that Japan has no tariffs in this sector because that's something they could easily move on. So now we're required to look at non-tariff measures, which is also a focus of our bilateral deal in TPP. While I think that was a good deal, I believe that Japan can go further in the automotive sector, particularly in the standards area and in the area of new technologies and vehicles. I think we can work together on issues like driverless cars, new energy vehicles, and find joint solutions to the challenges they present. So then we get to the question of TPP versus a bilateral agreement. And this is the most difficult area on which to find common ground. And both sides seem to be very dug in with their respective positions. We have seen TPP openings by President Trump in recent months, only to be closed. But on the positive side, I think this suggests that TPP is being discussed internally in the administration, and that I'm hoping over time people will recognize its value. With respect to the bilateral versus the FTA, it's presented as an either-or proposition. But I don't think that has to be the case. In fact, I think a hybrid approach can be followed, an approach that includes both elements, both the TPP and a bilateral agreement. In my view, the U.S. should agree to TPP rules with minor changes, keeping agriculture TPP market access as is, and allowing for more improvements in the automotive sector. And to accompany this, Japan and the United States should agree to negotiate a bilateral agreement on TPP Plus rules, including areas in TPP where the two countries can go further than the other 10 in areas like state-owned enterprises, digital trade, or standards, but also in new areas. I mentioned new energy vehicles, the area of 3D printing, industrial subsidies, etc. In other words, TPP can be the foundation, and the bilateral deal can be used to build on that foundation. Such an approach could allow both sides to declare victory, and it also reasserts U.S.-Japan leadership at the forefront of defining trade rules for the future. At the same time, it provides market access in the more traditional areas, including agriculture. But just one word of caution, and that is, this is based on my years of negotiating. What is critical is that before embarking on any formal negotiation, both sides must have a clear understanding of each other's expectations, their priorities, and their so-called red lines, things that they could not do due to political and other factors. We followed that approach before we supported Japan's entry into the TPP, and while that process proved painful and took some time, it allowed both sides to develop a clear picture of the way forward and avoid misunderstandings down the road. Moreover, both sides must have shared objectives for negotiations if we are to succeed. If Japan, for example, feels like a reluctant partner again at the negotiating table, I fear that we will find ourselves back in the world of trade friction. This would not be in our mutual interest. In conclusion, with so much at stake in the global and regional trading system, we should be focusing our collective energies and efforts on shaping the rules of the road and improving market access for today and tomorrow's economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to open this up for questions from our audience, but before doing so, let me start us off with a question or two and a little conversation with Wendy Cutler. Thank you very much for that comprehensive perspective. You know, I think this question of whether Japan should enter into a bilateral negotiation with the United States is rather top of mind now, because the Trump administration has signaled its interest in doing that. And one area that may give some hints on the priorities of this administration is, in fact, its recently concluded negotiations with South Korea. And since you were a principal negotiator of the Chorus Agreement, and have doubtless looked at what has been the adjustments that this administration has pursued, I wonder if you could share a little perspective on what those adjustments are and what they mean, and how one might think about their significance.
Well, the U.S.-Korea FTA renegotiation, I think it's instructive for our trading partners in certain respects, but in other respects it was pretty unique. It's instructive with respect to the administration coming into the negotiation and making tens and tens of requests, some people say up to 50 requests of Korea, but then at the end of the day, agreeing to a much more modest outcome. So I think it's an example where, once again, there were threats of withdrawal, there was a lot of requests, a lot of bluster, but when you look at the outcome, it's pretty modest and pretty conventional. And what does that outcome include? It focuses on the automotive sector, and in that respect, the administration followed the approach we took with Japan with respect to having long tariff staging for the U.S. truck tariff of 25%. Korea agreed to a 30-year staging. That's what Japan agreed to in the TPP when we were part of it. And they also agreed to further expand the equivalency, the acceptance of U.S. standards that Korea would provide in the safety area. And there were a number of other areas addressed, including the investor-state dispute settlement. Korea got something on trade remedies, and a few other issues, and I believe this agreement will become public in the next couple of weeks. There also apparently is a side agreement on currency that will go a bit further than the agreement that was reached on the side of TPP between the TPP finance ministers in 2015. But the Chorus negotiation was very different than the NAFTA renegotiation, in that the NAFTA renegotiation is much more extensive, and the administration is using trade promotion authority to pursue that deal. With Korea, because they focused on fewer issues and the U.S. did not have to change any laws with respect to the Chorus Agreement, they do not need to seek Congress's approval. My view is if we do ever embark on a U.S.-Japan bilateral agreement, the administration would follow trade promotion authority. They would need to, and it would be a much more extensive agreement than the modest improvements made under the Chorus Agreement.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting reply. I'm thinking, as you say that, about your remark that if you were giving advice on where the U.S. and Japan could go forward, you could imagine a TPP Plus agenda that would be worth pursuing, that would say TPP is a baseline and where can the U.S. and Japan go further. If you think about the Korea Agreement and what was negotiated, has that thinking been relevant in the Korea agreement, or is this really more backward-looking than forward-looking?
I think with respect to the Korea agreement, because the changes were so modest, it was really looking at the current situation and kind of dealing with issues, implementation issues, and other issues of friction on the table, that it did not set an agenda for future work with Korea. For example, one area where I thought would have been a very good area to improve on KORUS would be the whole area of digital trade, because the e-commerce chapter was negotiated over 10 years ago, but the administration chose not to do that. So I think it was an agreement that really focused on the moment versus the future.
So this is an area of, I must say, of particular interest to me, the digital trade agenda, and it's one where TPP, I think, has the most far-reaching provisions of any trade agreement. And I think there were prohibitions on data localization requirements. There were e-commerce provisions. Could you speak a bit more on what you think the TPP achieved in digital trade, and what, in your view, going beyond that could mean with Japan? Are we sufficiently allied in our thinking around privacy, security, data issues to really push this forward?
Well, one of the TPP's major achievements was the digital trade chapter. And it's really incredible that when the TPP 11 countries went back to the table and looked at provisions to throw out of the TPP or to suspend, they kept the digital trade provisions intact. And I think that's a really positive step forward, not only for the TPP 11 countries, but I think that will really help set the standard for the region. And one of, you mentioned a number of important provisions in that chapter. The other one I would just underscore is the important provision of the free flow of data. That's important not only for high-tech companies, but more traditional manufacturing companies. Is only going to become more and more important, and certain countries are trying to restrict that data flow. I think if the U.S. and Japan could really push the agenda forward on digital trade, when I think of issues like 3D printing, where it's really unclear, is that a service or is that a good, and what type of trade rules should be put into place. I think that's an area ripe for discussion between the U.S. and Japan, including also touching on other sectors like artificial intelligence and new energy cars. There's just a lot of issues that can be fleshed out and addressed in such a deal.
Could you say a little bit more about what that means, AI and cars? These are areas that are evolving, where standards don't yet exist, where they are, I think, multiple implications for national regulatory systems. So are you envisioning that this would be an area where the U.S. and Japan could start identifying those characteristics, or actually having some binding rules?
Well, one thing I learned as a trade negotiator, it's always easy to negotiate rules before everyone's put all their regulatory provisions or restrictions into place. And a lot of these technologies, they're moving so quickly that we may find ourselves in a world without any trade rules and countries already having locked in certain standards or certain rules. So the time is now to really address some of these issues. And of particular interest to me, and I think something that we really need to grapple with on the trade front, is this notion that there's no longer going to be this very neat distinction between trade in goods and trade in services. And that's how the WTO is set up. That's how the rules in our free trade agreements are set up. And I think the U.S. and Japan, given their leadership and competitiveness in these sectors, working together can help set new standards and new rules, which at the outset could be bilateral, for example, but the idea would be to spread them to others in the region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I have a slightly different thesis about when rules can be set than the one you've just articulated. I have often felt that some countries, you can identify which ones are prepared to lock in international frameworks when their own system is in flux, and others are exactly the opposite. So we could debate that. Let me open it up we've got a wonderful audience here of many, many experts in the room, and invite questions or brief comments, but always ending in a question, if I may.